Event of the year. Today we're going to be having our speaker, Mr. Patrick O'Neill, discussing the Iran War. He is a professor at University of Puget Sound who has studied Iran and its people, along with diplomacy for many years, and has come to give some important information on this current global topic. Thank you guys all for attending. Thank you to the World Affairs Council and their board for helping organize this event, and thank you to all the people from Bellarmine Mall UN who attended. Without further ado, our speaker, Mr. O'Neill.
Just so you succeeded. Okay, there we go. All right. All right. Is that all right, boys? Yeah. So no podium. So I have all of these notes that a normal academic would spread out in front of them as like kind of holy objects to keep people. No, it's too late, man. What am I going to do with that space? It's not going to help me at all. So again, I would use them to like ward off evil, but instead I've stripped everything down into I think what we would call chicken scratch. I'll try to speak relatively briefly. Again, that's usually pretty difficult for academics, but as I think I mentioned to John, I actually don't enjoy hearing the sound of my own voice, and it's kind of unusual for academics, so I'll try to keep this brief. Let me do a disclaimer here, which is that I'm not a professor of international relations, which means that my focus isn't on the relationship between countries. So if you were hoping that I would provide some sort of masterful overview of the moves and counter moves between the United States and Israel and Iran, you'll be sorely disappointed. If you are more interested in a general discussion of the domestic politics on the ground in Iran, that's what I'll give a little bit of a take on, and then I'll try to answer whatever questions I can, so we'll do that. So let me begin by making an observation in some ways that undermines the purpose of this talk in the first place, which is to many of my students, I often refer them to and write about the work of a well-known political psychologist by the name of Philip Tetlock, whose work I would really recommend to you. He wrote a book about 10 years ago called Super Forecasting, which is about the ability to make effective predictions about politics. And the observation that he makes in that book, and this draws on probably 30 years of work that he's been doing on the same topic for a long period of time, is that in the research that he's done, he's found consistently that individuals who are experts in a specific field in politics are usually much worse at forecasting what is going to happen than the average individual, right? So if you were thinking that you would come to a talk and a speaker would tell you about something that's going to happen and enlighten you in a way that you wouldn't know, chances are you'd probably have a better bet at guessing what the outcome would be than that individual. Now the question is, why is that the case? It's part of this, I think, is a self-selection of the individuals who sort of forge themselves or fashion themselves to be experts, which is they tend to lock in on a particular set of ideas, on kind of minutia, on a particular framework. It winds up being pretty Procrustean. It winds up being, as Tetlock says, and he's borrowing from Isaiah Berlin, it's very hedgehoggy. You get kind of one idea kind of lodged in your head, and you think that explains everything, right? And we know this isn't very good for example, if we've got some idea that a hot stock pick is going to make us rich. It doesn't really work in trying to understand politics either. But those are the people that we're drawn to. Those are the explanations that we want. We want this kind of clarity. But in reality, those are the people who often get these kinds of statements about what's going to happen. They get them quite wrong. The one that comes to mind here, there's the obvious one right in front of us, but the one that comes to mind here is the case of Russia invading Ukraine. So the vast majority of experts on Russia said, no way they're going to do this. It doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. Putin can get exactly what he wants just by threatening. And then he goes ahead and does it, right? But for them, it's like in their framework of how Russia works, it doesn't make any sense, therefore it's not going to happen. And on the other end as well, people said, well, even if by remote chance he does this, of course, he'll be in Kyiv in 72 hours, which of course wound up being wrong as well. So we've got kind of two interesting situations there. And actually, I want to come back to the Ukraine case at the end of this talk if I can. I haven't been in Iran for a long time. I mean, as the system got more repressive, it became less and less wise to go there as an American. But I've been making multiple trips to Ukraine over the past 3 years, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. But then I'm thinking about how then this also ties into the expectation that many people had, and that was driving the United States and driving Israel, right? That if you attacked Iran, if you decapitated their leadership, then the government and the regime would be overthrown. The whole thing would be swept away, right? That's what was being banked on, right? And it's not just wishful thinking, maybe on the part of Trump, that he says, well, look what happened in Venezuela, I can do this again. But it's also, you have a very sophisticated intelligence agency, for example, in Israel, that says the exact same thing. Absolutely, we can do this. We just take out all these people, we find them all in one place, we kill them all, and then there's going to be a revolution, and we can make a deal with these people. So the question is, and the puzzle is for me then, why didn't that happen? Right? Why did that change not occur? Right? That's the real question here. So there's a couple of, I think there's 3 points that I want to talk about, and then we can open this up to some questions. We can have a little bit of a conversation. It was something that I wanted to mention here along these lines. That's now I think has maybe escaped me, but I'll come back to it here in a minute. So why do you get the failure to fail, right? Why does the Iranian regime not fall? And this is particularly interesting because the desire, the belief that you're going to be able to take the system out and you're going to prompt a revolution is predicated in part in that already going back to the late 1990s, there are this kind of waves and convulsions of mass protests that get stronger and stronger and deadlier, right? Already going back to the late 1990s. Right? And so this idea that all we have to do now is we have all of this combustible material and all we have to do is set a match. So why don't we get that? Why do we not get that revolutionary overthrow from the outside? One general observation that I would make if we were actually using the social sciences is that social science points out that if you look at the data, generally you can't carry out regime changes through force from the outside. Right? In general, the track record is poor. So whether or not we're talking about Iran, or we're talking about Iraq, or we're talking about Afghanistan, we've got a pretty good track record of usually this doesn't work. But if we look at the specific case of Iran, what are the things that we would look at here that we think are important? And I think there's 3 things that I would point to here. I would argue first that the Iranian state is more resilient than outsiders would give it credit for. I would argue that Iran still deals with, or the regime relies on, the legacy and repository of a still in some ways effective revolutionary regime. And then I'll point to a last one I think is really important, and that's the impact of nationalism. And that's where I'll kind of bring this all the way back to the Ukraine case. So let me talk about a resilient state. I mean, what do I mean by this when I'm talking about a resilient state? I mean, when you look at Iran on the surface, the system looks pretty dysfunctional, decades of sanctions, really strangled economy in many ways. But this is a political structure, so yes, we're talking about the government, we're talking about the leadership here in some ways, but I'm talking about just the everyday staffing of the political system from the top to the bottom, and that includes the coercive apparatus as well. This is a system that was built on, and I'll talk about that in a minute, this is built on, forged out of a revolution, right? So I'm looking at the audience, I don't mean to insult some of our audience. Some of us remember the 1979 revolution. I'm not looking at the students over here, they don't remember it, unless they're time travelers and they'll reveal themselves later. But this was a profound revolution. This wasn't simply a sweeping away of a top leadership and a handful of people executed. This was a fundamental transformation of the system where clerical authority was fused into the political order, where the economic relations were really dramatically transformed, where the country underwent 10 years of war with Iraq, right? So this system was, I like to use, because I think about the Museum of Glass, this system was annealed in sort of the crucible of a decade of war, right? Builds a revolutionary state, which is about preserving the country in the face of eradication by its enemies. So it's the United States, whether it's other Gulf states, it's Iraq, it's Israel, whatever the case may be. And so you have a pretty powerful state that's built as a result, a great deal of autonomy. And the example that, of course, everybody thinks of and I think refers to most often is the Revolutionary Guard, usually referred to as the IRGC. Right? And to remind ourselves, and this probably doesn't come up in the media all that often, but to remember that the Revolutionary Guard is a paramilitary body that is built out of the revolution and then built out of the Iran-Iraq war. So you have, and I say not military, but paramilitary, right? So there is an army, there is an air force, there is a navy, and then there is a Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard exists as a military force that is beholden to the supreme leader, right? It is a political military organization. That's very, very different from any system where you have a military whose command and control is basically to the state. Change top leadership, military goes on, right? But the Revolutionary Guard exists as an independent actor in its own right to defend the ideology of the revolution. It's also enriched itself over the course of the last decades, right? Assets that were seized after the 1979 revolution, many of them came into the hands of the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard is in many ways factionalized. The Revolutionary Guard has enriched itself because of sanctions, because it's deeply involved in things like smuggling, okay? So this is really critical, because when we read the news about the war and we see references to the Revolutionary Guard, remember that any political change would mean that almost certainly the Revolutionary Guard would have to be dissolved. So if you are those actors, then the war is not just a question of, well, we would have new leaders and we'd go on our merry way. You would be divested of your job, you would be divested of your economic assets, you'd be divested of your political interests. Right? So that's different than a normal military leader who says, okay, we have a new government, a new constitution, but I'm still a general, I'm still commanding troops, I'm still doing whatever I need to do on a regular basis. So there is an element of this political system that I think we ignore that element, I think, at our, not necessarily at our peril, but certainly for some people at our peril. And that, again, I think ties into the second point that I was making about revolutionary ideology. And the point that I was making about revolutionary ideology is that even though the regime comes to power in 1979, this doesn't change the fact that the revolution is still, relatively speaking, in the lifetime of revolutions, it still has a long way to go, right? So the Ayatollah Khamenei, who we just assassinated, right, came up through the ranks of the revolution itself, right? So they have not moved through their first generation of revolutionary leaders. So if we want to draw an analog to other revolutionary states, right, we think about the Soviet Union, and we think about Lenin, and we think about Stalin, and we think about Khrushchev, and we think about Brezhnev, and we think about these various generations that cycle through the system as the system undergoes this period of decay, as revolutionary ideology kind of falls apart. So this is where we'll tell the Soviet Union joke, because it just pops into my head, right? So the Soviet Union joke is, right, Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev are all sitting on a train. The younger students have no idea who we're talking about. So they were Soviet leaders. Sorry, I make jokes at their expense, because what else are you going to do if you're on stage? They're all on a train. The train's going down the track, and the train comes to a halt. And Lenin says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of this." And he goes down and he goes and harangues the engineer of the train with revolutionary fervor. And nothing happens. He comes back and says, "Well, I'm out. I don't know what else to do." Stalin says, "Oh, that's no problem. I'll take care of this." And so Stalin goes down to the engineer and he just shoots him. And they come back and the train still doesn't move. They don't know what to do. Right? Khrushchev says, I don't have any idea. Brezhnev says, "I got a great idea. Let's pull down the blinds. We'll rock back and forth, and we'll pretend that we're moving." Right? So if we think about that as the kind of life, like bad joke is the life cycle of a revolution, right, we are still in that kind of, I would argue, in that kind of Leninist, Stalinist period of Iran, right? So this revolution, not to say that, oh, that means, again, we're going to predict, I'm just going to do the math, and that means they have another 37 years. That would go against exactly what I opened this talk with, but to say that the system potentially has still more revolutionary life within it, at least within the state itself, right, than we might otherwise think. This isn't, again, not to say that this system couldn't collapse in 6 months, in 18 months, but to say that the revolution is completely exhausted, that the individuals in the ranks of the Revolutionary Guard or in organizations like the Basij, like these people all are completely cynical and believe in none of this, I think is a mistake. I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. So the revolutionary ideology, again, feeding back into the resilience of the state, which is the thing that I opened with. And then that would lead me to the third point here, and I'm kind of thinking about these as I'm sort of envisioning in my mind as these kind of three sort of overlapping circles. And that the third point that I would make is one of nationalism. And the nationalist element, I think, is so important here. And it's one that we tend to miss, I think, from the outside. But it matters, I think it matters a great deal. And it will bring me back, to the Ukraine discussion that I started with in the beginning. So even if we set aside the current regime, and even if we set aside the 1979 revolution, we set aside all of the institutions and legacies of the Islamic Republic, it is important for us to understand that Iranian nationalism is strong, it's broad, it's deep. And it can be activated by or activates itself in the defense of the nation in a way that people, I think, again, underestimate. So now we have to go way back further in our history. If we sort of scratch our heads and say, okay, how far back would, as an American, as somebody living in Pierce County, how far back would we take kind of our understanding of Iranian history? Say, okay, well, I know there was the 79 revolution, and then there was the Shah, and then there's like this whole period that maybe we don't know anything about that. Like there's something, what was the 18th century, what was the 19th century? But we start going back centuries and millennia pretty quickly, right? All we need to do is look at the Book of Esther. All we need to do is even dig into our own Old Testament, right? And there are the Persians, right? And there's Cyrus, and there's Darius, and there's Xerxes, and there's the battles between the Persians and the Greeks, and between the Persians and the Romans, right? And that these are elements that I think deeply inform and shape Iranian identity. These things have waxed and waned over time. They've appeared and disappeared. But what's really interesting about history is the way in which it can be resurrected and reanimated by people to kind of re-enchant and mobilize people in the present. And this has happened throughout, I would say, recent Iranian history. And one important thing about Iranian nationalism, I would say, is that if you look at the Iranian Revolution after 1979 and contrast it with other fundamentalist movements like, for example, ISIS, which attempted to negate, or the Taliban, attempted to negate and destroy pre-Islamic history, this was never the case in Iran. So Iranian history, deep Iranian history, vastly predates the advent of Islam, right? And exists sort of alongside it. So this would give you, then I will tell you the anecdote that I once, this experience that I had in Iran some years ago, which to me captured this in one of the strangest ways. I think it was at Persepolis, and I had run into a couple of young Iranian men who were there on a kind of pilgrimage, and they learned that I was American, and so they wanted to start having a conversation with me, and they revealed themselves to me. They said that they were Iranian nationalists, and then they began to engage in sort of anti-Islamic sort of polemics. I'm in Iran, right? And we step back, right? And they're sort of starting to like attack Islam, and I'm sitting here as the American, like trying to sort of like, like I don't think we can make all these claims that all Muslims are bad. They're like, no, Muslims. They're literally, one of them said to me, no, Muslims, they're all terrorists, and I'm like, I don't know where I am exactly now. I'm very, very confused. And that sort of historical linkage, I think, is really important up into the present, because we have to understand that when we're dealing with the war now and the various layers of the war and the way in which the regime is attempting to kind of maintain support, even if we go back to the time period between the last set of attacks by the United States and Israel and the start of this war, it was really interesting to watch that one of the things that the Iranian government did is it reached specifically back into that pre-Islamic history and used not religious symbolism, but pre-Islamic symbolism. For example, the taking of the Roman Emperor Valerian was again sort of lauded to tell the people, look, you're not fighting for the regime, you're not fighting for Islam, you're fighting for an Iranian nation. And irrespective of a regime type, you have to also remember that populations, even if they're not necessarily going to go to the battlements to defend a regime that they don't support, they're not necessarily going to embrace an attack from the outside that suggests, as was the case, that the individuals who are attacking you maybe don't want to liberate you, but would rather just obliterate you, which again was rhetoric that the United States used, unfortunately, I think on more than one occasion. So I would say those three elements, the still relatively powerful state, that sort of repository, although albeit waning, of revolutionary ideology fused into the state, the way in which the state both can draw on and the way in which nationalism still exists independently, I think goes a long way to explaining why it's a lot more difficult to take down this political system than many people on the outside would think. And there is an interesting parallel here, and I come back to the very beginning, which is this, for very different reasons, this is exactly the reason why Ukraine didn't fall. So a nationalism built in a very different sort of way. Yes, built historically as well. If you go to Ukraine, Ukrainians will tell you in the way in which Persians feel like they are distinct from the world around them, and in many ways they would say culturally superior to, like the Arab world around them, for example. Ukrainians also will look askance at Russians and say that's an inferior culture, a backward culture. Kyiv was already a tremendous city when Moscow was a swamp, and so they'll engage in all that kind of language. Although there, the nationalism really has been built around this idea that we deserve to have a political system where we have the right to choose our own future. So it's what we would call a civic nationalism as opposed to, say, an ethnic nationalism that we might find in other places. But there's a fascinating parallel between the Ukrainian case and the Iranian case, where also, I think, even in the Ukrainian case, Ukrainians themselves didn't realize the kind of resilience they had until their mettle was tested. So I think Ukrainians are not crazy about Iran, as you can imagine, given that the Shahed drones that attack them on a regular basis were, of course, originally imported from Iran and then taught to the Russians, and the Russians that have continued using them with devastating effect. But there is this kind of fascinating bookend, almost kind of funhouse mirror of these two battles that are in some ways more similar than we may think. Regimes very different, but in both cases, I think a lot of the kind of state resilience, a lot of the national identity goes a lot of the way to understand why both of these political systems have continued to stand. And I think the Ukrainian case, where everybody thought they wouldn't survive, should give us, again, yes, democratic system, albeit a very flawed one, but I think that should give us pause to imagine that Iranians would be amenable to the perception that outsiders are going to dictate their history. And so I think that aspect, that framing, that dynamic is really pretty critical here. I've actually beaten 30 minutes, John. Okay. So I'm going to stop there, and then if we want to chat about anything, we can chat about whatever you want. All right, thanks. Well, mine wasn't good enough for you?
For them to use as well.
Oh,
so
yes.
We're now going to be opening the floor to any questions that you might have regarding the talk, or any questions just about Iran in general. So this does not seem to be connected to a speaker. It was not set up before we came here, but I think it's a small enough space that we can all project our voices enough for everybody to hear. So if anybody has a question, please just raise your hand and our speaker will call on you, and then you can get your questions answered.
I'm going to sit down.
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Okay.
don't know that I need this, but just in case we do, I don't know what we do with it. Okay, I don't know if I can answer anything, but stuff you want to talk about. And I think as I sort of, I sneaked into there before, which is the actual past tense. It's not snuck, it's sneaked. You want to have a micro presentation. So for the last 3 years, I've been traveling in and out of Ukraine. I'm not doing research, but doing volunteer work, actually with my son over here, Thomas. So we've been working on supporting the war effort there. That includes, we've been doing drone assembly. We've been producing food for Ukrainian troops. We've been hand weaving camouflage nets. Did I miss anything fun we've been doing? It's kind of the funnest stuff.
Bird sanctuary.
and he's been supporting actually a pretty cool project of bird sanctuary there as well. A lot of birds that have been casualties of the war. So if you want to hijack the conversation and know anything about those experiences or what we've seen on the ground in Ukraine, I'm happy to talk about that as well. That's certainly, at a personal level, something really very close to my heart. Yeah.
So I just had my retirement ceremony last week.
Congratulations.
So this is my 1 week Army Freedom beard.
Nice.
I would like your perspective on perhaps what you think, maybe the thought process from our side. What's our game plan here? What does winning look like? You know?
Yeah, there's no winning on our side, right? I don't think so. Now I'm going to do, right? Now I'm just going to. These will be more visceral, emotional responses that will come from a place of anger rather than analysis. So, and also the observations that I'm going to make are basically me regurgitating something I read in the New York Times. You say, that sounds a lot like something I read in the New York Times, and then I'll pass it off as my own. Everything that I have read under these circumstances is that the Trump administration was convinced using Israeli intelligence explained to him, Netanyahu explained to him, again, all we have to do is we just need to kill all of them. And if we kill all of them, then everybody's going to be out in the streets. And let's be honest, when the Supreme Leader was killed, lots of Iranians were out in the streets because they, hate his guts and were happy to see him go. They weren't expecting that then that would mean that the entire infrastructure of the country would be wiped out. It also didn't mean that they would go out in the streets and say, okay, we're going to take up rifles and we're going to go up against the Revolutionary Guard or these individuals. But that was the idea, right? That this is this idea that we've seen it before on the American side, which is that you can come in from the outside, you can do something surgical, and then you can step back, and then the actors on the ground will sort it out. And sort it out two things. One, they'll take matters into their own hands, so then we can walk away. We can do this all from the air. We don't have to troops on the ground. And then secondly, not only will they take things into their own hands, they'll take things into their own hands and steer it exactly in the direction that we want it to go. So those are two big assumptions, right?
Yeah.
That are both really, you could get one and not get the other.
This isn't a question, but in my view, I joined in 2006, and that conflict went on for a very, very, very long time. And when all of this stuff with Iran happened, I sort of, maybe in my own head, felt a collective veteran groan of disgust and disbelief as to us. How could we possibly be so stupid as to ensnare ourselves in yet another, quagmire, which at this juncture seems to be. That's why I was asking, well, what's the goal? And I think you're right, but it's a lot of wishing and hoping and immature thought at the Pentagon, in my view.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I think your point here, just my limited read of the media, I think now, and some of you may get a very different take on this, and given what you're reading, I'm surprised at how little media coverage actually is going back to Afghanistan or Iraq. It's as if those had never happened. But like, oh, now we're doing this. It's like, didn't we do something like this before? I have this vague recollection that we tried to kill a bad guy, and then we thought by bombing the hell out of the bad guy, then everything would go the direction that we wanted, and then something went wrong. I can't really remember what. You remember a lot better for the people that were on the ground. So that kind of, what feels like, it's odd to have historical amnesia for something that's not really history.
Right.
Yeah. Somebody else had a hand up, I thought, over here. I'm sorry. And then
just
I'll go
about
back.
your,
Yeah.
I think, okay. The question of feelings for nationalism to the country, I assume, and not toward the current regime. Why aren't the Iranians doing more to take this opportunity to sort of rebel a little bit more than they?
Oh, but they have. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't have good data. In the last round of protests, I mean, there are estimates, I think I've seen estimates as high as 10,000 people killed.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, so we could talk about lots of American rhetoric of laying down their lives. Lots of people have been killed, and every wave of protests, more and more Iranians have been killed. So, I mean, I think after the last round, I mean, what has actually been amazing to me is that as those protests have happened over the last 20 or more years, and the government has responded with ever greater violence and repression, and I mean, the repression is really horrific, that you will get, I would say, and this is interesting, and could certainly undermine all the arguments that I'm making. I mean, we're in a real wild card here. The thing I wanted to finish up with was, it feels to me like that this war has given the regime two things. One, it's given it a kind of new, I would say, temporary lease on life, that it's been able to batten down the hatches and to kind of reorient itself around basically a wartime structure, a wartime ideology, these sorts of things. So I think that's important. But another element here as well is that my worry is, and people have been worrying about this for years, is that with the passing of the Supreme Leader, this will drift now into a system which is more, from the Roman perspective, is more Praetorian, which means that the military now calls the shots, by which we mean the Revolutionary Guard, and that individuals like the Supreme Leader become more of a puppet. And so then that becomes a highly militarized system. And in a system where violence is the currency of control, what's been amazing to me is that I think if you look over the past 20 years, the gaps between these between these demonstrations, which then are responded to with violence, the gap between them is getting shorter. I would say shorter and shorter. So there were protests in the late 90s, and then there were protests in 2008, and then you had protests, and they've been going from like 10 years to 8 years to 5 years to 3 years. And so once this conflict ends, however it winds up ending, there will be another round, but certainly after the result of this war, my assumption would be that the government would be even more poised to use even more violence against the population to stay in power, which is a horrific prospect, but since that's been the pattern, I don't see why that would change. I'm so sorry, you had your hand up, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to give you a very, very, very update. You know, it's very new that today the Islamic Republic, you know, has the internet back.
Yeah.
And it's talking about having the filtering gone, and we can see a lot of changes, which is not, you know, Islamic Republic, is happening since the new leader has come to power. But I have two questions for you. One is about Shiism. You talk about nationalism and, you know, how it goes back to 3,000 years ago when someone says that they can wipe up the civilization and take it back to the Stone Age. I would say that, okay, that means the Persian Empire.
Right.
So, yeah, we wouldn't mind. We wouldn't mind. Yeah, we wouldn't mind. Give it a try. But that Shiism, you know, since Safavids, and it's about 300, 400 years ago, we can see that it's being revived through the past few years, and Mujtaba himself, the new leader, is the one who is carrying that, you know, flag. I would like to know about your idea, because you have, you know, you're an expert on that, how that could be of an effect where people, although they are against the regime, they would not go as far as inviting, you know, and, you know, Sunni, supported regimes like Saudi allies plus US.
Yeah.
And the second question, which is I'm sorry, it's being long, but it is shorter. You talked also about the opposition groups in your briefing. I'd really like to know what you think about what is going on now with opposition groups in the United States specifically.
Yeah, the last one I don't know. And you know, I mean, and just the strange things that you're hearing now that first it was thought that, you know, perhaps the United States thought that we would help facilitate the return of the Shah. And to be fair, I mean, there was, among younger people, from what I've seen, there's been some support for the Shah, not because they knew who he just simply was somebody that the government hated. And so, well, the government hates this guy, so maybe he would be good. But now there's some rumors that I mean, if you remember this, if you want to go back a while, that now some stories that the United States thought maybe that we would bring in Ahmadinejad, who had been our mortal enemy, the supposed Hitler, who was going to destroy the whole world with nuclear weapons. And now some discussion that maybe at one point the Trump administration was thinking about trying to bring him in. I don't. This is sort of crazy. You know, there's a powerful Iranian diaspora around the world, which is both wonderful and then also terrible for the country, because the country does such a great job of driving out talented people. And there are, and I don't know. I mean, there are many talented people who have risen up, who could play such a critical role in political change in Iran. What Iran still perhaps needs is it needs someone who can bring all of those disparate voices together and bind them through some kind of leadership. Maybe that person is already out there. Maybe we already know them, but so many of these talented people either wind up in exile, or they wind up in jail, or they wind up dead. So maybe that person is still yet to come. There was a question. Your question was about Shiism, and you know, I don't want to go too much into it, but you have answered your own point. You made an observation here, it was a really critical one, which is that, of course, Iran is an overwhelmingly Shia country, Persians, but also Azeris, for example, which some scholars refer to as a kind of Iranian Islam, even though you find it in other places as well. You find it in Lebanon, you find it in Iraq, you find it in Bahrain, places like that. But that Shia identity is also a really important aspect of what makes an Iranian, and I think even for individuals, in the same way that I think Iranians will adopt and continue to use particular kinds of Zoroastrian practices, while not claiming that they're Zoroastrian, because it's an important part of their history. So we sometimes talk about cultural religion as opposed to a religion of faith. And I think the revolution did a wonderful job turning Iranians into being not religious, which is what revolutions often wind up doing, which is destroying the ideology that they try to ram down people's throats. But Shiism isn't going to go away, and as a cultural repository of practices and of history and of understanding, that's going to be really critical. So in the failed revolution of 1905, 1906, one of the reasons why that revolution foundered was this question of what's the relationship between religion and secularism, when there were the first challenges to the Qadr dynasty. And there will be a really interesting conversation in Iran when that transition happens. And I think it'll be very different from what we would expect, which is sort of pushing Shiism over in a corner, but understanding that it plays a cultural role, but it can't dominate people's political lives. And it's going to be a different kind of, I think, it's going to be a different kind of conversation than the conversation that happened in Europe, for example, where you separated religion from the state because you had religious wars and things of that nature. This is going to be a tricky path, but it's not about making the faith go away, because the faith is critical to understanding who they are as Iranian people. And so I'm glad that you raised that. Who else has it? Yeah.
I'm curious, do any of the Gulf states support the protesters, and are they armed? Do they have weapons?
But you're asking whether or not the protesters had weapons.
Right, you said like 10,000 were killed, and I mean, is there
They shot in cold blood. Yeah, they weren't armed. They were out in the streets and just gunned down. As far as we know, again, because of the internet blackout that was mentioned, we don't have information really of what's the. I mean, there has been increasing restrictions. There have always been restrictions on the internet. Now it's just been down, although it's, I think, just came back up in the last day, partially came up in the last day. But the protests that have happened in the past are people going out in the streets and the government simply, responding with gunfire. Now, again, I think what one of the ideas, again, or sort of hopes or fantasies of the Trump administration was that they were going to arm. So there's a Kurdish population in the northwest of the country that, and that if you look at Iran and you look at Iraq, you have the northern part of Iraq, which is Kurdish and largely autonomous, and that Kurdish population extends into Syria and extends into Turkey. And then you have a significant Kurdish population up in the north of Iran. So Iran is a multicultural society. So there's a significant. There are Gulf Arabs, there are Baluchis on the border with Pakistan. There's a significant Azeri population on the border with Azerbaijan, and there are the Kurds. And of those populations, impressionistically, I would say it's the Kurds who would, and historically, have demanded the most autonomy from the rest of the country. And of course, this is shaped in part because there's a really strong Kurdish national movement and community in neighboring Iraq. So I think the Trump administration hoped that what they would do is they would arm Iranian Kurds, and the Iranian Kurds would do kind of like a thunder run. They would do what happened in Syria, right? They would just kind of sweep down into Tehran and overthrow the government. It's problematic in all kinds of ways, but eventually, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, this didn't wind up happening. I don't think they would have been successful anyway. I think the Revolutionary Guard probably would have stopped them in their tracks for the reason that we see the Revolutionary Guard wasn't going to fold. So this wasn't going to be Syria, right? So what we saw in Syria, we saw a long civil war, and then we saw one faction of the opposition move and realize that the system was completely brittle and collapsed because nobody was invested in the system. All they saw was a political order that existed only to keep Assad in power. It's not analogous to the Iranian case. The dynamics are really, really, really different here. And so again, that I think is a really critical aspect, and making those comparisons then takes us down some misleading paths. Yes, ma'am.
Well, let's suppose the United States leaves the area and the Iranians start rebuilding. I just wonder that it seems like there's been so much damage to their infrastructure that it's going to be really challenging for the government to get everything back in order unless maybe the Russia and China come in to give them a lot of help. And I wondered how that would maybe make the government stronger or weaker.
I think this is one. I think your question hangs in large part on the reason why one, as I always have these disclaimers here, because I'm no more informed on these things than any of you, and maybe less so. One of the reasons why a critical stumbling block for the current negotiations is Iranian demands for funds. I mean, first they started with demands for reparations, which said you're going to pay us for all the damage that you did. Now, I mean, I think they have backed away from that and are demanding funds that have been frozen as part of the sanctions. So the 24 billion, 12 billion, but they want money. I mean, in this case, they want money that's actually theirs, right? That's been impounded through international sanctions. So I don't know anything, but I don't think the Iranians are I don't think Iran is going to walk away unless there is some kind of financial compensation for all the damage that's been done to the country. And I think this is very difficult, as you could imagine on the end of the United States, it's very difficult for Americans to imagine that we're going to pay for all the stuff we blew up. Right? They're just like, you just can't see Trump really. And so I think they're already trying to they're having conversations about, well, what if we sort of left the money on a doorstep over here and we said it wasn't ours? And then you walked over and got, I mean, not exactly that, but something fairly similar. Like, well, it gets deposited into account, and then other people can draw the money on it so that you can buy things from them, but we never gave it directly to you. And I mean, these are the sort of crazy things about diplomacy, right? Where it's like, well, I never actually gave it to them. Like, I gave it to a friend, and then they gave it to a friend, and then they left it on doorstep. So it wasn't so maybe something creative like that will happen. I worry because everything that I understand is that the United States has some of the most inept negotiators that we have ever deployed in the international system. So if you are, and no disrespect to anybody here in this position, but I would not send somebody who works on real estate deals to negotiate things like, as we're calling it, nuclear dust. Or otherwise known as highly enriched uranium. I don't think it's really dusty. I don't think we need pledge or anything, or Swiffer that would take care of it. But yeah, I mean, on the American side, for example, as part of the negotiations, the American team is simply not under, and I don't understand that material, I don't understand that well either, but I'm also sitting in Tacoma, I'm not negotiating international treaties, but the American side also doesn't clearly have been in situations where they have not understood things like uranium enrichment. And so when the Iranians are saying, we'll do this, or we have this, the American team simply doesn't understand the technical side of things. That's really, really, really bad. Because I don't know how you come to negotiations. Money, I think they understand 25 billion. But if you're saying, oh, well, we're gonna down blend this uranium, it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? What does that exactly look like? Do you know? Maybe you should know, right? Does it require a blender? Do you need a spatula? We should probably figure these things out. But I think our negotiating team on our side is actively, their hubris of their ignorance is their energy, right? They are coming from a position that what our strength is that we don't know, and we don't care that we don't know. All we care is that we just want what we want, right? So there's this sort of powerful, I think, embrace of ignorance because it's built, and I don't know, you're saying, well, that's mean. But I think it comes from this idea that people who are, it's a warped version of the point that I made to start this off with, which is that people who are wrapped up in all the details miss the big picture. So just don't worry about the big details, just worry about the deal. And if you worry about the deal, then the details will fall into place. Okay. But to say that I don't need to know any details, I think is maybe a mistake. There was a question, and I'll come to you, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, so given, say, the complexity of all that you described, these different, I don't even know what words to use, these different cultures within the Iranian, under the Iranian umbrella, the nationalism that predates the Muslim aspect of the country. If our goal, as a big one, is nuclear non-proliferation, what is the best, how do we best appeal to the decision makers and all of those aspects of, right, say the nationalism, and who are they? How do we appeal to them to achieve our ends?
You're talking about that on the Iranian side?
Yes.
We don't know who they are, so that's already a problem, right? Because we killed the people that we would negotiate with, and the new power structures are I think not solidified and are in formation, and it's oblique to us now. So,
but let's say it's not even the people that are in power. Let's say it's the people that are, let's say, the national identity,
mm-hmm.
right? No, they are not, even though they don't agree with the current regime,
right.
the past regime, they are going to fight to the death
right.
to preserve their national identity,
right.
and we are there to take it away from them. Let's just say,
yeah.
Imagine that. So how do we appeal to them in essence to get what we want? Let's say that is nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, at this point, I don't think you can, because we've completely destroyed our credibility. So that can't come from the United States. So, I mean, this popped into my mind here. In a moment, you would need to approach Iran. I mean, again, you've lost this now, so now we're in a position of how do you establish any kind of relationship with a country and a leadership and a population that feels that they are completely disposable in your eyes. If you can get past that point, then a starting place, a thought experiment would be to treat Iran more like you would treat France, right? They're prickly, right? They don't want to be treated like they're in the backseat. They have a history, they matter. They're going to march to their own drum. I would also point out that France also has its own independent nuclear capacity. So at this point, I really don't have an answer for you. We have to get past this point before I think someone, and I don't think that's going to come. I don't think that can come from the United States. Maybe a new administration can do that, but I mean, there's been so much damage that's been done here that I don't even. I'll just be honest. I don't really know where if I were in that situation, I don't even know where I would begin. So I'm sorry. That's a really frustrating answer. Yeah, sir.
Sorry.
Yes,
We're
sir.
unfortunately on a time frame, and we have to be out here by 8. So we don't have any more room for questions.
Oh.
But Mr. O'Neill, thank you so much
Yeah,
for coming tonight.
thanks everybody. I appreciate it.